If students of color feel left out of these institutions, which in many ways they are, the best way to solve this issue is to provide a direct democracy where every student gets a vote, where it's not who's privileged enough to run and throw their hat in the ring and take time off to become the USC president. Direct democracy will give everybody a voice, and an equal voice at that.
We're the only campaign that's going to create a stipend program so that no matter your background, if you have to take time off from work to run, to serve, we're going to make sure that you're compensated for that. So you don't have to sacrifice your employment and paying for school so that you can participate in student government. And that's something that I believe very strongly.
Some of the language that's used by other candidates, or not on this election, but other candidates in previous elections, or even just the general public to put down women or people of color that are trying to run for these elections is definitely worrying. I think the best way to deal with that is through trainings, EDI training for the campus, for campus body, but also it's just to change the culture around that. I think that can be done with training.
Andrew, in your platform, you say you will rebuild and formalize the USC's special privileges for Western fraternities and sororities, which counselors voted to end last semester. Why should the USC give Greek life these privileges, which include financial subsidies, rather than supporting these groups to apply for club status?
Honestly, if I was sitting on the USC, I would have voted the same way, because the people who came to the floor and represented the Greek community were not representative of the Greek community. So we've identified a community on our campus that has issues. We know that there's alcohol and substance abuse issues. We know that there's sexual and gender-based violence issues. We know that there is equity, diversity, and inclusion issues. And instead of actively addressing this and saying, we need to go in here and fix this, we said, we're going to remove the problem. And so the USC represents all students, and that includes people who are in Greek life. Students are going to continue to actively go into Greek life for the many benefits. So we should look at how we can make programs that can help address these issues.
So number one concrete action we're taking, setting up a dedicated Office of Election Diversity. And now that office has a lot of responsibilities, naturally, but one of their responsibilities is to proactively make sure that we have diverse candidates in our elections.
I'm a 3-time SOF. This year I'm on the head team for social science SOFing. I think that the training has been pretty minimal. It's not very inclusive and has not been updated in a while. And we don't really understand things like, what do you do when your frosh is confiding in you? What happens if someone is coming out to you? What if someone is telling you things that need to be brought up to a new level?
Obviously, having the private security is very important, but what we have to recognize is there's a lot of people in our community who don't feel comfortable going to those positions of authority. So we need to look at an intersectional approach of how we can bring community resources onto our campus that can work with their people and help them understand their direct problem.
So I totally agree with the hybrid model, and not just for the purposes of giving students the option of whether they want to take the risk of coming on campus or not. I think the hybrid model has been great in giving students more freedom. They can choose when and when they do not want to go into class. I think this provides great flexibility, and as we're moving into a new technological age, we should encourage this kind of thing. Mobility will no longer be a restriction, and where you physically are is not an impediment to your education.
Ethan, your platform names some big ticket spending items, such as increasing the number of mental health counselors. In the event the USC does not have resources to fund these additions, would you choose to raise student fees or cut current services to fund them?
I think raising student fees should be completely out of the question. So I think that, as you said, the cutting the student programming is definitely the right option. But I do also think that the USC, as a $33 million non-for-profit, has money for these programs. I don't think that there should be a cap or a budget on these important programs for mental health, for survivors, things like that.
Ben, in your platform, you say you will advocate for Western to refund ancillary fees for services not delivered during COVID and investigate how the USC can do the same. Given that these funds are likely been reallocated and your aim is to refund fees to students, what USC services will you cut to make this feasible?
I think when we're talking about rebates, we're talking about the money, where it's coming from, I think the first thing we actually have to talk about is justice. The reality is students were made to pay for services that they did not receive, that they did not get. And I think it is totally unjust for us to say, oh, well, the money is here, the money is there. And that should somehow be a reason that we're not able to give students the money that they paid for services that were not rendered and were not delivered to them. In terms of figuring out how exactly we're going to come up with the money, I think there's a lot of areas to do it, right? The USC throws a lot of relatively extravagant events. Do we really need the biggest name artist at what events or what have it, right?
Your platform looks backwards. We want to look forwards. If you spend your whole time as the USC president trying to make up for the injustices that happened during the pandemic and get students back money, which in all honesty probably is not going to happen, you'll have wasted your whole term, wasting even more money with nothing to show for it.
I'll just start off with the naloxone. It was actually suggested to me during my consultations with SOFs. And I understand what you're saying. We're not trying to put more responsibility on people. But at the same time, if you're not going to provide these tools, you're still putting your students at risk. We don't want to be relying on the SOFs. That's not the idea. But we can't be actively taking away the tools that we have, right? So we need to make sure that those systems are still in place while we address those cultural issues of overworking our SOFs.
I've been lucky enough to be able to consult with members of Innova, who's an organization around London. And I think that the most important thing is to start with training. Training first years, training student leaders, which student leaders are members of executives, of clubs, things like that. And also just opening it up for the larger student body to join into. I think a great idea people have is always to make sure that if you want to join a club, you have this training. I think it's super important to have these consultations with important members of our community, such as Innova, such as soft leaders who have been...
Ethan, with all due respect, I really do think that consultations are important, but we do consultations. We do talk. We do this consultation community thing. The reality is this is a crisis that continues day in, day out. We need real tangible actions.
People have been talking about action and training programs for decades now. And what has been done? What does it show for it? We're in the midst of a crisis.
Have you spoken to Innova about their training so far? I've spoken to the responses of first-year students who have been pushed their understanding of consent with this training. There are very powerful and great groups on this campus and in the London community that have a much better understanding than myself. That's why I bring up the consultation process.
So we need to be partnering with the London community. We know that our students are leaving campus regularly. Why are we not exploring partnerships with these downtown locations? Looking at the London bars, Richmond Row, where we know students frequent, and saying, hey, this is where the culture is most prominent. How can we make changes here as well? We're going to provide you these drink covers. We're going to provide you your bartenders, the training on this type of stuff.
I don't want a student from a socioeconomic background where they can't have a taxi or an Uber to feel like they have to stay in a compromising situation. For far too long, we've heard nice words, but what we really need is action, real, tangible action to solve this problem. And so the first thing I would do is I would spend whatever amount of money is necessary to solve this problem once and for all.
The problem with a lot of the candidates I have here is they seem to believe this problem can be solved if you simply throw enough money at it. More training programs, more rides for Ubers, more this and that. But the problem is this is not an economic issue. This is a cultural issue. We have to teach them about rape culture. We have to teach them...
Michael, I don't think telling softs to tell their kids not to have sex is some sort of magic solution to the problem either, right? Like, I think we need to be realistic.
That's a gross oversimplification.
No. Culture is important. We do need to work on culture as well. But I think a lot of thinking about culture is often a little bit of a ticket for leaders to not have to deal with the real issues because they can say it takes a long time to change. It's complex. It's difficult.
The USC is overreaching. It will never be able to actively grab everyone. And what we need to do is we need to focus on enabling our smaller communities through clubs, through our faculty council to engage those communities, bring them back into the circle.
Thank you, candidates, for joining us, and thank you at home for watching.